mentioned, we're going to be talking about transformational donor partnerships today. And what we'll discover is that it really comes down to relationships, inviting donors into relationships. And this conversation will help us to think differently about it, think biblically and practically of how we can relate to and journey with our donors. It's scary, there's fear involved and uncertainty. But I really pray and trust that that you'll be able to take something out of today's conversation to feel more equipped, that your mind is a little bit shifted, that you can walk in confidence in this calling that God's given you, to transform the relationship with your donor, because it is all relational, this call to raise funds. And we've got an amazing specialist to talk about this today. She's got over 20 years of experience in higher education and nonprofit fundraising, and really equipping ministries all around the world, over 150 ministries, if I'm correct, with deep expertise, and really bringing equipping and encouragement to them in capacity building, board development, leadership, so many topics. And this is one that she's particularly passionate about. One thing that you will not know about Maria that I was surprised to find out, and so cool, is she shared a story of where someone asked her, don't you just love fundraising? And she thought initially that the person was sarcastic or something, and eventually turned out that that person meant what they said. And after some engagement, Maria, it would actually be great to hear from you as well. She also found herself saying, actually, I really, really love fundraising. So we are hearing from someone who gets this, who actually got to a place where she loves fundraising for a reason that she can share. Maria, if you can just say hi and introduce yourself in a minute. So I'm excited to hear from you, and just the preparation of this has been so deep and thoughtful, and you've got incredible deep thinking and expertise on the topic. So thank you so much, Maria Zalesky, for being here and for sharing your knowledge with us. So would you please quickly tell us, why is it that you love fundraising?
Hello, everyone. I'm excited to be here, and I'm just in awe of what 54 is doing to equip leaders. So I'm really excited to partner with you, Nina, and with this organization. And yes, that was a true story. I was in fundraising in my career, and someone said to me, "Don't you just love fundraising?" And I thought, wow, is she crazy? She just used the words love and fundraising in the same sentence. But it took me stepping away from fundraising and learning a new model, a new method of fundraising where it's a biblical model, that it's based on transformation, not transaction, and it's based on building relationships. And I love people, and so it just made so much sense. So if we can change our view of fundraising, it really can change that role that we have to play in our ministries. So I'm
Mm,
excited to be here with you all today.
so good. Thank you, Maria. Me too. So in our preparation, one thing that you mentioned, one mistake that you see leaders often make is that they have this belief that they can't have a meaningful relationship with donors. You've mentioned that as probably one of the biggest challenges you see because you work with many ministries, so you experience a lot of this. And yet we see, if we start with the biblical example of what we see in Scripture, how Jesus and Paul really built support through relationships. Could you start us off in this conversation by sharing what we can learn from their example?
Yes, for sure. You asked me what are some mistakes that we see leaders either make or misconceptions, and I just love that poll at the beginning. I wrote some of them down, that it's just unknown, it's difficult to find common ground, you feel like begging, and that's very common. I hear that all the time from the ministry leaders that I work with. But if we don't know our donors or our prospective donors, how are we going to know what God has called them to support? And if we don't communicate with donors, how are they going to know the blessing of being a part of the mission and the ministry outcomes? And I know others have mentioned this book on this call before, but if you haven't read A Spirituality of Fundraising by Henry Nouwen, I recommend that you read that book. But there's a quote, kind of remember it, paraphrase it, but he says, all people are poor in some way. We don't need to worry about the money. We need to worry about if through the invitation that we give them and the relationship that we develop with them, they will come closer to God. So it's all about building relationship through communication with donors to further our fundraising. And I know you mentioned, I love that you read the verse from Philippians. I use that passage all the time in workshops, and we have awesome examples in the Bible from many different places in building relationships. But the best in-person relationship building that we can see really is looking at Jesus in his life. He had a supportive network of followers, including men and women, who provided for the ministry's needs. And he really exemplified that relationship building through intentional interactions with others. And you think about it, he was with all kinds of people, rich, poor, in between. Sometimes I hear from ministry leaders, wow, these wealthy people are really busy. They don't want to hear from me. But, Jesus interacted with all kinds of people, rich, poor, and anything in between, men, women. He prioritized spending time with people and sharing meals. So great example of in-person relationship building. And sometimes in person isn't always possible, and we realize that. So we really need to look at other modes of communication that we may have available to us. So think about Paul. When unable to visit a church in person, he used letters as a way to communicate. And I love the examples. If you read through Paul's letters, what a rich example of beautiful communication that we have there. So he used letters to build relationships and keep in touch with people. And really, his letters were an extension of his ministry, aiming to strengthen churches and address issues and guide believers in their faith. So we really can learn so much if we read the Bible thinking, okay, how did people communicate with others here? There are so many great examples.
Great. Thank you, Maria. You mentioned communication, and that's what we really want to dive into is the role of communication in relationship building. So what I also loved about what you said is Jesus prioritized time and building relationship. So it really comes down to that priority and then the practical outflow of that is often communicating. So could you help us understand what role does communication play in building these kinds of relationships? Why is it important?
Well, if you think about it, building any relationship in your life, whether it's with a prospective spouse or a leader at church, communication really is key in building the relationship. And specifically with Paul, we see his communication and letters really being a main tool to keep that relationship alive. And today, as nonprofit leaders, we have to communicate with donors to keep the relationship and build the relationship, and not just transactionally where we're going to give updates or ask them for money. That's very transactional, but really we need to change our mindset to think about building trust and maintaining that relationship. So if we focus on that, the relationship with the donor becomes less transactional and more like building any other relationship in our life. I, I worked with a very generous donor at one point in my career who told me that he rarely gives to an organization until he's fostered a relationship with both the organization and knows them well and with the leader. And so when you think about it, it's like needing to borrow something from a neighbor or asking a favor from someone. Isn't that more natural and easier to address when it's with somebody that you know? So it's really important to think about, okay, how do I build the relationship? And maybe you need to go back and foster some relationships with some people who are already giving, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But, most of the ministries that I work with currently, for them, frequent in-person relationship building with donors or prospective donors really isn't always an option. That in person, they may have some donors that are in the country where they serve, but other donors are maybe in another city, in another country. I have that as well. And so fortunately, in the times that we live, God's really given us some options there. And while statistics do show that face-to-face meetings are the most effective communication method for building relationships, there are other things that we can do. So how can we replicate being in a room with someone? And so again, what we're using right now is Zoom meetings. You're in South Africa, I'm in the US. There's people on here from all over the world. So utilizing Zoom and FaceTime and Teams to be able to have meetings with donors. I do that frequently. Many of the donors that I work with are not in the same city. So we'll set up Zoom meetings. Online prayer calls are a great way to get to know someone, introduction to people on the ground, in the field, serving God. And, for an example, I work with several older donors who don't travel. So how are they going to see the work that's happening on the ground in another part of the world? And so SRG, the organization that I work for, does a great job of offering webinars on a regular basis so that the donors could essentially be in the same room with the ministry partners and get to know the ministry leaders and see their work. So awesome ideas, but all that to say communication really does play a role in building that relationship. And again, in addition to the face-to-face interaction, think through what are other modes of communication that you can utilize to build relationships. They're maybe not as personal or personalized, but definitely can help us stay in touch, just as Paul's letters did. So, is it texting? Is it emails, newsletters? It's really important to find out what are those communication methods that your donors respond to, and
Mm.
to make sure that whatever you use, your messaging is consistent and clear and impactful. So just
Oh,
some tips, and we'll dive deeper into that, I think, in a little bit.
well, yeah. Maria, this is slightly off script, but something that you said, a word you used, really struck me in the way that you said it. You used the word alive with relationship. And I was just thinking maybe there are leaders on the call where, it's hard to think which relationships, which communication channels are working. But if you kind of scan through your donors and the relationships with them and think about it being alive or dead, that's quite a helpful approach to think, that's what we're trying, that's the end goal. The practical outflow, each person in their context are going to have to figure out. We'll talk to some suggestions, but it's going to be different everywhere. But could you tell me just quickly what comes to mind for you when you say a relationship with a donor is alive?
That's a really good question. Are they engaged? Are they involved? Do they respond? I think through your own life. I think through a time where I got really involved in an organization. I was invited to something. I was really excited about what they were doing. I went to an event and I gave a small gift. I was a new person with that organization, and then I stopped hearing from them.
Mm.
And until the very next year when they did their event again, and I received an invitation. And by that time, the relationship really wasn't alive. It was cool. I was really excited at the beginning. So thinking through who's responding, who's keeping in touch. Maybe you do need to even do a poll with your donors to find out what is the way that they want to hear from you, what's the frequency they want to hear from you. So every person is going to be a little bit different, as you said, but ensuring that those relationships are kept warm, so that people are growing with your organization.
That's so good. And it's good to hear that it's okay. It's okay to ask him. run a poll. How do you want to be communicated with? Because the end goal is keeping that relationship alive.
Mhm.
Thank you. That's so good. So, like any relationship, this was so helpful for me to make this mind shift as we prepared. It's a relationship like any other, and any relationship has got a start where it's initiated and then it somehow grows or dies, and hopefully it transforms into something more. Could you help us think about, what are typical stages in the journey with a donor? Where do we typically start? Where do we want to end? What can we expect? And how do we change our communication to serve and be appropriate in the different stages?
Mm. Good question. Well, if you think about it, communication should develop as the relationship develops. Now, you'll have certain communications like your newsletters and things that go out to everyone, but think beyond that per specific donor. So think through people who you're just getting to know. Maybe they've not donated before, maybe they're new, someone introduced them to you. So, how do you get to know a prospective donor? And I really liked some of those comments in there, finding common ground. They're unknown to you. So think about in a relationship with anyone else, how do you get to know them? I always think about my daughter and her husband when they were dating. They had a really intentional date where they asked each other really deep questions. And this was maybe the first or second date that they were on. So ask about the donors, ask about the person that you're trying to get to know. That's the best way to get to know them. So, really at the beginning, making sure that you're setting time to do just that and to not just to tell them about the ministry. I know as ministry leaders, we often feel like when we meet someone new, we are going to tell them everything about us. We're going to throw as much information at them as possible. We're going to tell them about our work and our impact. But really pulling that back at the beginning and really focusing on getting to know them as a person. There's a method of using discovery questions where you have questions you're asking about their family, their work life, their church life, their story of faith, how they came to know Jesus, asking them what they're passionate about, other causes that they support, and then asking them how you could pray for them. That sometimes really surprises people where ministries are always asking, pray for us. Pray, this is how you could pray for us. This is how you could pray for our country. But often donors are not asked how you could pray for them. So that is a great way to create and start the relationship. Even if you have a relationship going with a donor, a prospective donor, and you haven't done something like this. I've been in that situation where someone's been giving and I look at my list and I think, wow, I don't really know that person. I'm going to set an appointment to get to know them. So think about that in the beginning, adding that to your regular schedule of communications. Once perhaps you've established a relationship, maybe it's just time to nurture the relationship. Think about it again. Any relationship needs to grow and people need to become more involved. So, looking for ways to engage people in a different level. Maybe it's volunteering. Maybe it's taking a vision trip to come visit. Different ways that people can be involved. Maybe it's being on a prayer call or organizing a prayer call, providing opportunities for them to continue to learn more and more about your ministry. So if you think about it as a continuum, as a cycle, people come in and you're getting to know them, but then nurturing all along. And at some point of this growing relationship, in your engagement may involve asking for a gift when you know that the time is right. And so again, asking is a time to honor the donor with the blessing of being involved. How else could they do work in your country, in your cause, without going through an organization like yours? You are providing the platform for their personal mission, and they are an equal partner. So, asking for a gift is a whole big topic that we'll not get into now. I know I've done complete workshops on asking for gifts. But just the big point is to remember that you are honoring the person by bringing them into the mission with you. And then finally, as you said, bringing kind of to the highest level in communication and relationships. Once people are involved and giving, it's definitely not the time to end the nurturing of the relationship. It's important to be thanking people well. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but to thank people well, to continue to engage them deeper and deeper. And eventually the conversation should turn to how can they help you as an advocate? That really is the highest level of engagement and relationship. Maybe they can introduce you as the ministry leader to others who may want to partner. Your current people are the best way to find new people to engage with their ministry. So really the highest level of relationship is engaging them as an advocate. So all of these different steps to grow the relationship.
Thanks, Maria. It's so helpful to think about these different steps and to realize communication in those steps would be different. So I want to go into the last one because I've also seen in the registration a lot of questions go to how do we take an initial donor that starts out and try help them grow from being just an every now and then giver to really an advocate that partner with us in the true sense of partnership. So could you share with us what are ways you've seen that works that gets them there? And how can we equip donors to be advocates for our organizations?
So there are different ways to do this in growing people into being advocates, but really communication and building the relationship, finding out how they want to be involved, how they like to be involved, and then continually asking them to take another step with you. So maybe it's hosting an event for you. Maybe you're in another city or in another country from the donor, and you can ask them, could you host something at your home so we could come and tell others about our organization? And so that's a time where they could invite their friends. And that's a very strategic way to grow people. The more steps that they take with you, the more they want to be an advocate with you. I would always think about asking people to share their story. And sometimes we have to equip donors and board members and other supporters, sometimes we have to equip them to be able to share their story. And I know I've seen other people on this call talk about storytelling and not just storytelling from the standpoint of the ministry, but storytelling from the standpoint of the donor. What's their story of change with your organization? I have seen donors' lives completely changed by being involved with the ministry. And so one man told me the Middle East was never on his radar until he got involved with ministries in that region. And now he is an advocate. He's just infectious talking to people about this region and these organizations. So how can you equip people to tell their story? Sometimes it's fun to have a call where you ask people to share their story of change from being involved with your organization. I've done that with board members, and it's a really fun activity to do. Maybe equipping involves preparing emails that they could send out on your behalf. So if you ask people, hey, could you share our ministry with five of your friends? Instead of just leaving it at that, equip the donor with materials, with a sample email that they can quickly change and make their own. Maybe an online brochure or a link to the website, making it easy for them to become your advocate so they don't have to create everything themselves. So all different ways to equip people.
Those are some really good and equipping examples. Thank you for sharing that. And it's good to get that off the back of the previous question of, we're not going to ask this feeling guilty because it's going to come from a relationship that's been nurtured, a relationship where it's two-way, that's alive, where we feel like, wow, this donor is so invested in us. They so believe in us. They're actually burning to be advocates. So we just hand them what they need to be able to do that. So it's so great and such a good perspective. Thank you, Maria. So as we think of the different stages, we need to communicate different, we need to use different types and different purposes of communication. Could you help us think through like what are different types of communication with the different purposes?
So, first, I would recommend taking a look at your communications and deciding if they're strategic or as many leaders, and I know I work with a lot of small organizations where they don't have a communications manager. Think through what can you do to have your communications be strategic. And I would recommend developing a rhythm of communications, maybe having a communications calendar to plan out your communications of what will be sent out when and which way. Is it email? Is it a newsletter? Are you going to make a call? So planning out either month by month or by quarter. That's a great way to be intentional in your communication. Also, another strategic method that or strategic idea for clarity and impact, looking for clarity and impact. Are your communications something that you would respond to? Or maybe poll some of your supporters and ask them how your communications are landing with them. It's a great way to be strategic in what you're doing and looking at what you're sending out. There's a quote that I love. It's from George Bernard Shaw that says, the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. So think about it. It's not communication unless it's received well by people, that it's landing with people. So now, just think through the communication, different categories. If you're planning out your communication calendar, so let's look at some categories. So, acknowledgement, thank you letters. Are you thanking people well, or do they just get an automated thank you through the website? Are you doing handwritten notes, or could you make a call from time to time just to really thank people well? That goes a long way in communication right there, is doing a little bit more to thank people well. We talked a little bit about engaging. Are you using your communications to engage people? I mentioned prayer call. Several of the ministries that I work with will do a prayer call with staff, with donors, with board members. Miracle Connect just had one. I was on one recently with a ministry in Turkey called Hassat, and the leader did such a great job of having people on the call and giving us some prayer points. Here's how you could pray for the country of Turkey. And then we went to breakout groups and prayed. And then we came back together and she said, here's ways that you could pray for the ministry. And we went back to breakout groups. And by the end of the call, everyone on there said, can we do this again? This was wonderful. There were people on there from all over the world. And so finding ways to utilize your communications to engage people, and that may be something that you haven't thought of before. Informing. So many people will do a year-end reporting, but think through other ways that you can inform and report on your outcomes in the ministry work. It's so great to tell people how their partnership is working and the impact of their partnership. I saw some text. So, International Justice Mission uses text. I saw one time that said, "With your help, we just saved 10 women from slavery." It's real time reporting and informing. So think through ways that you can pull people in through your communications by telling them what's happening, and then perhaps equipping. We just talked about equipping people to be advocates. So all some different ideas and different types of communication that leaders may not be using at this time.
So good. Thanks, Maria. I'm just looking, or I was thinking about the AHA slides again, and some of the leaders saying, I don't know how to engage with donors or not knowing the best way to ask. I know some of what we've discussed speaks to this, but just for the sake of someone who might still feel, I'm still not really sure, what would you say to that leader who says, I don't know how to engage with him, or I don't know what to ask?
Well, again, starting with getting to know them is a key. If you get people talking about themselves and their life, it's a great way to learn more about them, learn what they a way that you might want to engage them. So if you're asking them about other ministries they've supported, what are they passionate about, and they say, I've supported and I've been passionate about programs for women, or maybe it's trauma healing or programs for children. And then you think, okay, we have different programs in our organization. Maybe that's something that I should try to get them engaged in. So by asking them about themselves, it really does reveal something that they're passionate about and ways that you might want to engage them. So again, I go back to learning about the person, but often we think, oh, I just they're just not in the same age group. They're not in the same country. They're not. How do I get to know them? But God created people to be in community, and people love to share community. So much of it is our mindset going into the fundraising. And I just was thinking about an example of I worked for a Christian university at one time, and I thought I was giving to the university that I worked at through my employee giving. And one day I received a call from a student, and I thought, okay, they're going to ask me for more money. The student is calling, but the student just called to do what I'm talking about here. She called to say, we appreciate that you're giving to the university. I know you're an employee. Tell me about you. Tell me about your job. What about your family? And I was so impressed with this young person who had to be between 18 and 21 years old calling and asking me as an older person about my life. And so just thinking through what are some questions I would want to be asked? And so as you build that relationship, it really makes it easier to get to the point in relationship where you're going to ask for a gift.
I'm so glad you shared that example. That's really powerful, and that you mentioned it does require a mind shift. Mind shift. That's often the thing that really holds us back, and
Yeah.
leads me to my last question. Then I'll head over to some questions from the leaders. I see we've got some questions in the chat. But as you and I close our conversation, what are other principles or mindset shifts that will really encourage leaders as they carry with them this drive towards transformational donor relationships through intentional communication?
Well, the mindset shift is big, and again, we want to think about fundraising in that relationship building. What do we want for that person, not just from them? What do we want for them? We want for them to have treasures in heaven. We want for them to have a close relationship with God. We want for them for their relationship with Jesus to grow from being involved with our ministry. I think about the ministries that I work with and how much my faith has grown and as a result of my relationship with the ministries that I work with. So keeping that in mind is such a key. I would say also moving forward, we've talked about a lot today and at a very high level, an overview. But you can't do everything. And I realize there's probably quite a few ministries on here today that are smaller ministries. I work with quite a few smaller ministries. You can't do everything. You come on a webinar and think, oh, these are good ideas every time I'm on here. But how do I do this as a small ministry? And so I want to
God
affirm that
translated to
that's
somebody.
very common, but My suggestion is just to pick one or two ideas that will make the most impact now on your donor communication and just start with that. Say, okay, this year, maybe I'm going to focus on intentionally building relationships, having some face-to-face Zoom calls or in-person meetings. I'm going to really work on building relationships with our donors and prospective donors. Or maybe you say, well, I don't have intentional communication, so maybe I need a communications calendar. And I'm telling you, communications calendar really is very freeing if you plan out your communications ahead, because I have been there where I've been in a month and I think, oh no, I haven't communicated yet. I haven't sent out a newsletter. I haven't made donor calls. So maybe the one thing that you pick is having a communications calendar. Maybe it's adding a type of communication that you hadn't thought of before. Maybe something like the prayer call that I mentioned, or maybe another way to engage people. Maybe it's maybe you haven't done a newsletter, or having people join a prayer group where you're sending them a monthly prayer request. So just think of some creative, different types of communication that you might not have thought of before. So again, just pick one or two things to try. You can't reinvent your communication plan all at once. So I would just make some small gains that way.
Mm, that's great. Thank you so much, Maria, and for those examples. I'm going to pull a question from the chat that links to the last bit that you're saying, and you're saying this is a common challenge you find is the question is, when you have hundreds of donors, how do you get to know them?
That's a really good question. When I was in fundraising at a university, as you can imagine, I had a really long list. I would categorize my list by, okay, these are major givers, top level donors. Here's kind of medium level donors. Here's lower level donors. And here are people who are on my list who've not given before, but I need to build a relationship. And then I would intentionally each week pick. I did it. I changed up the way that I did it. Sometimes I would work through a category. Sometimes in a week I would pick two from each category and say, okay, what is needed in this relationship? And I would, sometimes it was a direct call. Sometimes it was reaching out via email. Sometimes just texting and say, hey, how are you doing? I haven't talked to you for a while. But I would pick people in different categories, and I'm a paper person. So sometimes I would have my list and highlight who I was reaching out to that week and pin it to my bulletin board that was in front of my desk so that they were on my mind. Something new that I've been doing in the last few years is making an individualized plan for each donor. So I'll take a donor and I'll say, okay, this is when I last met with them. And I would pray over the notes from the meeting and pray for that person. And in the next section, talk about, okay, what are my next steps with this person? What am I going to invite them to do next? Maybe it's to ask them for a gift. Maybe it's to ask them to engage more. So sometimes thinking through an individualized plan like that helps. I would also, if you're at a small ministry and it's just you doing the donor communications, I would think about engaging maybe a board member or two who are gifted in this area, who are relational and can help you with those relationships. It doesn't have to be all you, it can be another staff member or a board member to help foster those relationships. So, those are just some ideas for working with a large list of donors.
Thank you, Maria. So, linking to that, there's another question that asks, should many people from the same organization approach the same donor?
Also, a good question. And also, as you can imagine, what we dealt with at a university where maybe you have an alum who was in several different, maybe they were an athlete and they were in the School of Business and they were in music, and you have all those three departments reaching out. And so I would encourage you, if this is something that's happening with your organization, ensuring that each donor has a relationship manager. So and maybe it's you're all one organization and you have a board member and a staff member and the executive director all have a relationship. Make sure each person has a relationship manager that's coordinating all of the communication. So in where I've worked before at universities and other organizations, if I was going to reach out to someone and I'm not their relationship manager, I would always check in with the relationship manager first because you don't know if somebody else had reached out that week. So it really needs to be a coordinated effort. It's the communication piece at a university, as you can imagine. They're getting pieces from different departments, they're getting calls from different departments. So ensuring that someone is coordinating that is very helpful because otherwise it looks like, okay, the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing in this organization. So that's just a tip to work through.
Mm. Good insight from also the perspective of, the end goal is building a relationship that is alive and true. Maria, another question is, what about beginners or startups? This leader has asked, how do we start introducing ourselves and build bridges between ourselves and donors? And then there's a question that links to that. I'll add it in there if you can address both. How do we find these donors to reach out to?
That's probably the number one question that I get in fundraising. And I know it's difficult. And I know, I mean, just hear me say, I know it's difficult. And everybody struggles with that starting out. Some organizations will go to Christian conferences and have a booth and meet some people that way. I know we did that in the last year with SRG. We went to a few different conferences and had a booth and met people. And then it's all about fostering and growing that relationship. Often, I would say that when I talked about the engaging people through having them host an event, if you have even three people who are sold out on your organization and excited about what you're doing, can you ask them to host something for you, either in their home, host you at their church, their women's Bible study, anything? If they can host you, really the best place to find new people is through people you already know and introductions. We are in the process of doing that at SRG as well. We are doing these regional events where we're asking either board members or friends of the organization, donors, to host something and to invite their friends. And then we come and tell them about the organization. We bring a few ministry partners with us so they can actually meet people who are doing the work on the ground and then just have a meal together. Sometimes it's just appetizers, but just very relational. That's a great way to find new people. So it's difficult. And I realize it even an organization like SRG that's been around for 20 plus years has those issues. How do we find new people? But it's just getting out there, getting in front of people. I know I was fundraising for another organization at the time, and I was invited to speak at a fundraiser for another organization. So I just introduced the leader and talked about the good work they were doing, and I talked a little bit about the organization I was from. And the very next week, I got a call from an assistant of a doctor who was over a bunch of different clinics and said, this doctor was at that event that you were at and really resonated with what you had to say, and he wants to learn about your organization. And so just getting out there. And I know for some ministries, I work with quite a few ministries that are, it's really difficult to be out there because the region that they work in is difficult. So you have to be a little bit more secretive and not be outward facing, and that makes it a little bit more difficult. But working through people you already know, going to larger events where there are quite a few believers who are there in just networking. And I know for some people, networking is not natural. And I didn't say before in doing those meetings with the questions, if you could have a list of questions that you're going to ask people. I've been in fundraising a long time, but I'm not a naturally inquisitive, natural questioner. So often I'll prepare things ahead of time in my mind that I would ask people. So if you're not natural in networking, come up with some ways that you think would be good to engage people and practice ahead of time with people that you know.
Love that. That's so good. It does take a bit of preparation, but
Mhm.
it just sets you up so much better. And good to hear that you also found it challenging. Maria, this first question of how do we introduce ourselves and build bridges with donors? I know there's a little framework that you used that you share because you've seen many leaders struggle to introduce themselves and their organization. Could you share that with us, please?
That's great. And I'm glad you mentioned it because I forgot to mention it. The very first activity that I do when I'm coaching a ministry is I have them develop a case for support. And from an organization called Mission Increase, I love their case for support, which has four parts. And often when I first got into this work of working with ministries, I would ask a leader, what do you do? What is your mission? What does your organization do? And often they would talk for half an hour and go round and round, and I still wouldn't get the idea of what the ministry does. And so, if you think about communicating in a very clear and concise way, so the case for support that I like starts out with the problem. What is the problem that your organization solves? What is the problem out there? Depending on the country that you serve in, the region, the city that you serve in. Why do you exist? What is the problem? That is really difficult for people to understand if they want to give, if they don't understand the problem, that's a difficult piece. Then number two, what are you doing to solve the problem? So that's where you bring in, this is what our organization does. These are our three programs that we have that are solving the problem. And then the third part is what is your impact? How you could have numbers here. We've served this many people. How are lives different? How are communities different because of your organization? And then the fourth part is how they can join in your partnership. That includes giving, but is not uh, only giving. So how can they join you? How can they be praying for you? How can they share with others? How could they be giving? Come up with ways that they could engage. This makes a really well-rounded way to talk about your ministry. And I usually have people do a long form of that where they could use pieces of that in maybe grant applications or on their website, and then create a short form so that you have a well-rehearsed elevator pitch. That term, elevator pitch, I don't really like the term, but it's very common. If someone just says, hey, can you quickly tell me about your ministry? What do you do? If you have this down in those four areas, it makes it very clear and concise. I was put in a situation one time when I was fundraising. And I was with an organization where we were a sponsor, and they gave each sponsor 3 minutes with groups of the people that were at the event. So I had probably 20 groups come through my booth, and I had 3 minutes with each group. And so I started out with the problem. This is the problem that exists. Here's what we do to solve the problem. We've served over 10,000 ministries and they can grow. We show statistics of how ministries can grow and then how they could get involved. And I started out with a problem that I knew would get them thinking. And so it was an effective way to have people come through. So everybody in your organization should be able to do that, from the executive director to interns. to board members, to donors, everybody should be able to give that case for support. So that's something I would encourage you to start with if you haven't done that type of thinking.
That's so good, Maria. Oh, there's still questions coming in, but we'll find a way to. I'll maybe send that to you via
Yeah.
email. We'll share the responses on our WhatsApp channel, but it's time for us to close this conversation. And it was so rich and meaningful with you. Thank you for sharing all of your expertise and just your heart for Kingdom Impact. And again, thank you everyone for being here. It's always great. You